This audio presentation is presented to you by Lyghthouse. There are no rights reserved, therefore, freely share this useful information with whomever you wish. Deja vu will occur on many occasions while you are being entertained by this audiobook. Many dark secrets and ill reasonings behind most dreaded occurrences in our lives were created long ago by our US government and those invisible who govern them, then hidden from the masses in order to incite fear, power, and control over the masses while at the same time acquiring profit, power, control, and wealth over the masses to be divided among themselves. Because of the negative impact of the information exposed and then reburied back in 1965 when this report was written, most, if not all of those hindering effects are still taking place in the United States today in 2023. Pre-disclosure is unnecessary as will vivid and imaginative jaw-dropping details will present themselves as visualization within your mind on several occasions while listening, due to the exact similarity of 200-plus-year-old events, and events quite possibly happening as you are listening to this book. The Moynihan Report. One of the most important reports ever written exposing the U.S. government's entire hand in creating the American-African struggle in America, which by being kept from the lower-class masses of them, catapulted Patrick Moynihan into one of the longest American political careers in American history. The Moynihan Report Update 2020. The American-African Family, a Cause for National Action. A report written in 1965 on the American-African struggle in the United States written by Patrick Moynihan. Audio-visual brought forward by Alfonso Henley. Introduction. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was an American politician and diplomat who studied interaction and organization. He was an observer of the activity of social, religious, political, and economic groups. He also examined the effects of human influences, including different individuals and groups. A member of the Democratic Party, he represented New York in the United States Senate from 1977 until 2001, and served as an advisor to Republican President Richard Nixon. Born March 16, 1927, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Died March 26, 2003, Washington, D.C. Education, London, School of Economics and Political Science, 1950 to 1951. Tufts University, 1948. Children, Maura Moynihan, Timothy Patrick Moynihan, John McCluskey Moynihan. Spouse, Elizabeth Therese Brennan Moynihan, 1955 to 2003. After departing Tulsa, Oklahoma, Moynihan moved at a young age to New York City. Following a period in the Navy, he earned a Ph.D. in history from Tufts University. He worked on the staff of New York Governor W. Averell Harriman before joining President John F. Kennedy's administration in 1961. He served as an Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Kennedy and President Lyndon B. Johnson, dedicating much of his time to the war on poverty. In 1965, he published the controversial Moynihan Report. Moynihan left the Johnson administration in 1965 and became a professor at Harvard University. In 1969, he accepted Nixon's offer to serve as an assistant to the president for domestic policy, and he was elevated to the position of counselor to the president later that year. He left the administration at the end of 1970 and accepted appointment as United States ambassador to India in 1973. He accepted President Gerald Ford's appointment to the position of the United States ambassador to the United Nations in 1975, holding that position until early 1976. Later that year, he won election to the Senate. Moynihan served as chairman of the Senate Environment Committee from 1992 to 1993 and as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee from 1993 to 1995. He also led the Moynihan Secrecy Commission, which studied the regulation of classified information. He emerged as a strong critic of President Ronald Reagan, his foreign policy, and opposed President Bill Clinton's healthcare plan. President Clinton had campaigned heavily on healthcare in the 1992 presidential election. The task force was created in January 1993, but its own processes were somewhat controversial and drew litigation. Its goal was to come up with a comprehensive plan to provide universal health care for all Americans, which was to be a cornerstone of the administration's first-term agenda. The president delivered a major health care speech to the U.S. Congress in September 1993, during which he proposed an enforced mandate for employers to provide health insurance coverage to all of their employees. He frequently broke with liberal positions, but opposed welfare reform in the 1990s. He also voted against the Defense of Marriage Act, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and a congressional authorization for the Gulf War. He and Jacob K. Javits were the longest-serving senators for the state of New York. Defense of Marriage Act amends the federal judicial code to provide that no state, territory, or possession of the United States or Indian tribe shall be required to give effect to any marriage between persons of the same sex under the laws of any other such jurisdiction or to any right or claim arising from such relationship. The North American Free Trade Agreement was an agreement signed by Canada, Mexico, and the United States that created a trilateral trade bloc in North America. The agreement came into force on January 1, 1994, and superseded the 1988 Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement between the United States and Canada. On New Year's Eve 1964, Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan assembled his staff to announce that they were going to help him write a report on American-African families. The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, completed in March 1965, became one of the most controversial documents of the 20th century. Best known as the Moynihan Report, it launched the career of its author, who became a professor at Harvard University, a top advisor to President Nixon and a four-term U.S. Senator representing New York. Moynihan wrote the report on his own initiative, hoping to persuade White House officials that civil rights legislation alone would not produce racial equality. He succeeded in getting President Johnson's attention. On June 4, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson gave a major address at Howard University, based largely on the Moynihan Report and co-written by Moynihan and Richard Goodwin. Echoing civil rights leaders at the time, Johnson declared freedom is not enough. Equal citizenship for American Africans was incomplete without the ability to make a decent living. However, the Johnson administration quickly disowned the Moynihan Report when it sparked heated debate after becoming public in August 1965. Distracted by the Vietnam War, Johnson never followed up his provoking speech at Howard with significant new policies. The Moynihan Report became a lightning rod for civil rights activists frustrated with Johnson's indecisiveness. Moreover, the report's uncertainties and flaws, as well as Moynihan's decision to discuss racial discrimination primarily in terms of family structure, produced confusion over its aims. Many liberals understood the report to promote new policies to improve race based on economic differences. But conservatives found in the report a useful explanation for discrimination. They argued that only racial self-help could produce the necessary changes in family structure. Some even used the report to reinforce racist labels about loose family standards among American Africans. Meanwhile, left-wing critics attacked Moynihan for distracting attention from ongoing general racism by focusing on the typical American African family. Moynihan's leading critic, William Ryan, famously charged him with blaming the victim. The Moynihan Report is a historical artifact best understood in the setting of its time. Yet, it remains relevant today within current discussion of why racial discrimination continues despite the passage of civil rights legislation. Even those who do not see the report's breakdown as related to the present can learn how it shaped current discussion. Almost 70 years later, the Moynihan Report is still a disputed symbol among American thinkers and policymakers, mentioned by everyone from Barack Obama to Paul Ryan. A New York City police commissioner and its mayor publicly argued over the report, with the mayor calling it oppression and the police commissioner dismissing it as outdated. Liberals and conservatives alike praised the report's study, but it is still a curse to many on the left. Daniel P. Moynihan, William Ryan, Jacob K. Javits. Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Lyndon Johnson. Richard Nixon, Barack Obama, Paul Ryan. John F. Kennedy, Gerald Ford, Richard Goodwin. Acknowledgement. First of all, I'd like to thank a man who has already transitioned for supplying the keywords to unlock the door to the plethora of important information I am about to share with you. Thank you, Kevin Samuels, for a brief mentioning of the Moynihan Report before you abruptly hung up on an annoying caller. I crawl in the trenches, between the lines is where I dwell. One missed word that has fallen between the lines from surface chatter can be the seed to feed a nation. One of the first questions that came to mind after reading the Moynihan Report is, why am I just reading this report after hearing about it in a random conversation? And why has the report been so casually dismissed for almost 70 years? Of course, my questions are rhetorical. For I am clearly aware of the shortcomings I suffered while growing up as an American African in the United States. I am presently working on many other books, one titled The Conversations I've Never Had with My Fathers, which discusses and explains many details of why I, and so many other American African men in the United States, suffer the exact same shortcomings. For generations we have had no knowledgeable fathers to pass the wisdom. The misinformation passed to those of my kind kept me, and others who look like me, looking for answers in all the wrong places. From the improper birth from my mother's womb, to well into my 30s, I slept as I walked and consumed through every sense, every bit of distracting propaganda I could stomach, oblivious to what was vital for my, and those who are like me, survival. Through reading what I wasn't supposed to discover to read, I have discovered why I, and those of my kind, have been kept in the dark about absolutely everything that could assist in our rapid advancement. Because of key books like this report, the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, White Cargo, Who is the Bull, etc., etc., I have ripped the cover from many untrue truths we have grown accustomed to hearing and believing. We live accustomed to lies for the financial benefit of those who have carried the same lies for over a century in the United States. Preface. I have endeavored to prove that the invaluable principle of individual freedom, which, from the normal conquest downward, fired the most noble-minded of our ancestors to rebel against the tyranny of those who won, or inherited the rights of the conquest, is in imminent danger of being lost to us, at the very hour of its consummation. 250 years ago, in 1765, 9 assembled colonies first joined together to demand freedom from arbitrary subjective power. For the first century, we struggled to hold together the first continental union of democracy in the history of man. 150 years ago, in 1865, following a terrible fest of blood and fire, the Compact of Union was finally sealed. For a second century, we labored to establish a unity of purpose and interest among the many groups which make up the American community. That struggle has often brought pain and violence. It is not yet over. State of the Union message of President Lyndon B. Johnson. January 4, 1965. Author's note. The very first item that I'd like to point out is that Patrick Moynihan was born in 1927 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 6 years after, and during the time of the infamous Black Wall Street Massacre, and many other massacres of American African communities were occurring. I am willing to bet that Patrick Moynihan was somewhat influenced to write his infamous report about the disastrous massacres inflicted upon the independent American African citizens of the United States in Tulsa when he took it upon himself in 1964 to write about the struggles of American Africans in America. I am not certain how long Black Wall Street laid in ruins, but based on how long some of the ruins of black communities in cities like Chicago laid in ruins after the King riots, which I was an eyewitness, I'm sure it must have been decades, giving young Patrick Moynihan, in his teenage years, full knowledge of what had actually happened. The second item I'd like to point out is that a portion of Patrick Moynihan's education was conducted in London at the School of Economics and Political Science. This should trigger a question as to why is a potential American politician being educated in London, England, in order that he may obtain a political position in the United States? Well, the answer to that question is simple if you've studied any of Great Britain's history. A great many of the rules, now termed laws, that we follow today here in the United States were established sometime around the 10th century in Great Britain. This should trigger another question from you. If America won its independence from Great Britain in 1776, why are we still under the rulership of Great Britain? Could it be that America was never independent of Great Britain? Or did the leaders of the time go running back to the Queen Bee when they found independence was no fun without someone, slaves, because they were no longer the slaves they could depend on to do what the family depends on for survival? The latter is more than likely the case. You see, still today in 2022 the Anglo-Americans in America still do things improperly in the United States when it comes to including all of its citizens, especially the American African. It is well known by those who study the story that he tried to cover up and replace with his story that American Africans and the Native American had to teach the exiled European transportees the most basic things about human survival. Most, if not all Europeans during that era only bathed in the month of June, leaving 364 days of stank until the next bath. This also included brushing of the teeth. Why do you think George Washington made dentures of slave teeth? Apparently, the teeth of a slave were better than his own. How so for a so-called civilized white man? If the exiled European transportees were as civilized peoples upon arrival, there would have been no need to teach them to groom themselves or use teeth from a so-called subhuman slave. Another heavy influencer of Moynihan's thoughts was more than likely Tufts University, where he earned a PhD in history, and which is a non-sectarian institution, and secular institutions are not affiliated with, or restricted to a particular religious or political group. Tufts being Moynihan's school of choice would probably also indicate that Moynihan held no real love for any particular political party, which is more than likely why he was kept politically distracted until 2001. He physically transitioned in 2003 without seeing his most famous work, the Moynihan Report, one of the most important reports ever put together in America which catapulted Moynihan into the American political scene, acted upon. Moynihan went on to work on the staff of New York Governor W. Averell Harriman, who was a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1952 and 1956, as well as a core member of the group of foreign policy elders known as the Wise Men. The Wise Men, along with Governor W. Averell Harriman, helped to craft institutions and initiatives such as NATO, the World Bank, and the Marshall Plan. These crafts, two of which are known, are creations of robber barons, wealthy men, mostly of European descent, who rob and deceive the masses of the world by any means necessary. We all have heard of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and of the privately owned Jewish World Bank. We also know that both organizations are corrupt. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, also called the North Atlantic Alliance, is an intergovernmental military alliance between 30 member states, 28 European and 2 North American. Established in the aftermath of World War II, the organization implemented the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in Washington, D.C., on April 4, 1949. NATO is a collective security system. Its independent member states agreed to defend each other against attacks by third parties. During the Cold War, NATO operated as a check on the perceived threat posed by the Soviet Union. The alliance remained in place after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and has been involved in military operations in the Balkans, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. 30 European-controlled states involved in military operations in the nations of those of African descent. NATO's main headquarters are located in Brussels, Belgium, while NATO's military headquarters are near Mons, Belgium. The alliance has targeted its NATO response force deployments in Eastern Europe, and the combined militaries of all NATO members include around 3.5 million soldiers and personnel. Their combined military spending as of 2020 constituted over 57% of the global nominal total. Moreover, members have agreed to reach or maintain the target defense spending of at least 2% of their GDP by 2024. NATO formed with 12 founding members and has added new members 8 times, most recently when North Macedonia joined the alliance in March 2020. Following the acceptance of their applications for membership in June 2022, Finland and Sweden are anticipated to become the 31st and 32nd members, with their accession protocols to the North Atlantic Treaty now in the process of being ratified by the existing members. In addition, NATO currently recognizes Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine as aspiring members. Enlargement has led to tensions with non-member Russia, one of the 20 additional countries participating in NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Another 19 countries are involved in institutionalized dialogue programs with NATO. The World Bank has been criticized as promoting inflation and harming economic development, causing protests in 1988 and 2000. There has also been criticism of the bank's governance and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, let's take a look at the content of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, ERP, was an American initiative enacted in 1948 to provide foreign aid to Western Europe. Bombs bought with U.S. tax dollars blew it up, and U.S. tax dollars rebuilt their bombed ruins into the modern culture it is today. The United States transferred over $13 billion, equivalent of about $115 billion in 2021, in economic recovery programs to Western European economies after the end of World War II. Replacing an earlier proposal for a Morgenthau Plan, it operated for 4 years beginning on April 3, 1948. The goals of the United States were to rebuild war-torn regions, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, improve European prosperity, and prevent the spread of communism in exchange for capitalism. The Marshall Plan proposed the reduction of interstate barriers and the economic integration of the European continent while also encouraging an increase in productivity as well as the adoption of modern business procedures. Capitalism. In order that U.S. corporations may gain access to war-torn Europe after World War II, the hard-working U.S. taxpayers, after sending their children to die, had to foot the bill to rebuild what was once declared an enemy state. Well, if you've ever wondered how war-torn countries recovered so quickly after war with the U.S., we can pat ourselves on the back. We, the U.S. citizens, are the sponsors of their reconstruction and should own their land. Moynihan's alliance with the Harriman organization was short. Looking again to the background of Moynihan's life, he and Harriman would seem to be oil and water. I'm sure the experience Moynihan gained while in alliance left a sour taste in his mouth. Afterwards, as an Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Kennedy and President Lyndon B. Johnson, who dedicated much of their time to the war on poverty, how could Moynihan not been in disharmony with the Harriman organization who were elitist? Looking back to the creation of the Moynihan Report in 1964, in 1965, Moynihan published the controversial Moynihan Report. Then left the Johnson administration in 1965 and became a professor at Harvard University. In 1969, he accepted Nixon's offer to serve as an assistant to the president for domestic policy, and he was elevated to the position of counselor to the president later that year. After the publishing of the Moynihan Report, which is a study of the struggles of the American African, Moynihan was made busy at Harvard where almost no American Africans were in attendance, offered a domestic policy position, placed next to the president as counselor, keep your enemy close, shipped abroad on an ambassadorship until 1975, then served as a senator until 2001. Again Moynihan passed in 2003, and the infamous Moynihan Report is still just whispers. While in a Senate seat, Moynihan served as chairman of the Senate Environment Committee from 1992 to 1993, and as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee from 1993 to 1995. He also led the Moynihan Secrecy Commission, which studied the regulation of classified information. None of which had anything to do with the struggle of the American African in America. It must have been a cruel joke to place Moynihan as lead of a secrecy commission regulating classified information like that of his own work. If he would have violated any of the now well-known regulations, which surely he was completely scrutinized, Moynihan would have been placed in a grave well before his official time, March 2001. Chapter 1. The American African Revolution is rightly regarded as the most important domestic event of the post-war period in the United States. Nothing like it has occurred since the disorder of the 1930s, which led to the organization of the great industrial trade unions, and which in turn profoundly altered both the economy and the political scene. There have been few other events in our history, the American Revolution itself, the surge of Jacksonian democracy in the 1830s, the abolitionist movement, and the populist movement of the late 19th century comparable to the current American African movement. There has been none more important. The American African Revolution holds forth the prospect that the American Republic, which at birth was flawed by the institution of American African slavery, and which throughout its history has been ruined by the unequal treatment of American African citizens, will at least redeem the full promise of the Declaration of Independence. Although the American African leadership has conducted itself with the strictest respectability, acting always and only as American citizens upholding their rights within the framework of an American political system, it is no less clear that the movement has overwhelming international implications. It was not a matter of chance that the non-violent methods of thinking of the movement, as it began in the South, were consciously adapted from the techniques by which the Congress Party undertook to free the Indian nation from British colonial rule. It was not a matter of chance that the American African movement caught fire in America at just that moment when the nations of Africa were gaining their freedom. Nor is it merely incidental that the world should have fastened its attention on events in the United States at a time when the possibility that the nations of the world will divide along color lines seems suddenly not only possible, but even looming. Such racist views have made progress within the American African community itself, which could hardly be expected to be immune to a virus that is widespread in the Anglo-American community. The American African Muslim principles, based on total alienation from the Anglo-American world, exerts a powerful influence. On the far left, the attraction of Chinese communism can no longer be ignored. It is clear that what happens in America is being taken as a sign of what can, or must, happen in the world at large. The course of world events will be profoundly affected by the success or failure of the American African Revolution in seeking the peaceful assimilation of the race in the United States. The award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Dr. Martin Luther King was as much an expression of the hope for the future as it was recognition for past achievements. It is no less clear that carrying this revolution forward to a successful conclusion is a first priority confronting the Great Society. The end of the beginning. The major events of the beginning of the American African Revolution are behind us. The political events were three. First, the American African themselves organized as a mass movement. Their organizations have been in some ways better disciplined and better led than any in our history. They have established an unprecedented alliance with religious groups throughout the nation and have maintained close ties with both political parties and with most parts of the trade union movement. Second, the Kennedy-Johnson administration committed the federal government to the cause of American African equality. This had never happened before. Third, the 1964 presidential election was practically a referendum on this commitment. If these were terms made by the enemy, they were in effect accepted by the president. The overwhelming victory of President Johnson must be taken as a forceful popular endorsement of the unmistakable and openly declared course which the federal government has pursued under his leadership. The administrative events were threefold as well. First, with the establishment of the President's Committee of Equal Employment Opportunity and on the enactment of the Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962, the federal government has launched a major national effort to equalize the great imbalance between the economic position of the American African citizen and the rest of the nation that derives primarily from their unequal position in the labor market. Second, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 began a major national effort to abolish poverty, a condition in which almost half of American African families are living. Third, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 marked the end of the era of legal and formal discrimination against American African and created important new machinery for combating secret discrimination and unequal treatment. The act does not guarantee an end to harassment in matters such as voters' registration, but does make it more or less obligatory upon government to take further steps to prevent such efforts when they do occur. The legal events were no less specific. Beginning with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, through the decade that concluded in the recent decision upholding Title II of the Civil Rights Act, the federal judiciary, led by the Supreme Court, has used every opportunity to combat unequal treatment of American African citizens. It may be put as a general intention that the laws of the United States now look upon any such treatment as obnoxious, and that the courts will strike it down whenever it appears. Your rights under Title II. You have the right to full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, and accommodations of any place of public accommodation. You cannot be treated differently by a place of public accommodation because of your race, color, religion, or national origin. The demand for equality. With these events behind us, the nation now faces a different set of challenges, which may prove more difficult to meet, if only because they cannot be cast as concrete propositions of right and wrong. The major problem here is that the American African Revolution, like the industrial disorder of the 1930s, is a movement for equality as well as for liberty. Liberty and equality are the twin ideas of American democracy. But they are not the same thing. Nor, most importantly, are they equally attractive to all groups at any given time, nor yet are they always compatible, one with the other. Many persons who would gladly die for liberty are shocked by equality. Many who are devoted to equality are puzzled and even troubled by liberty. Much of the political history of the American nation can be seen as a competition between these two ideas, as for example, the unending troubles between capital and labor. By and large, liberty has been the ideal with the higher social prestige in America. It has been the middle-class aspiration par excellence. Note the assertions of the conservative right that ours is a republic, not a democracy. Equality, on the other hand, has enjoyed tolerance more than acceptance. Yet, it has deep roots in Western civilization and is at least contemporary with, if not prior to, liberty in the history of Western political thought. American democracy has not always been successful in maintaining a balance between these two ideals, and notably so, where the American African is concerned. Lincoln freed the slaves; they were given liberty, not equality. It was therefore possible, in the century that followed, to deprive their descendants of much of their liberty as well. The ideal of equality does not establish that all persons end up, as well as start out equal. In traditional terms, as put by Faulkner, there is no such thing as equality per se, but only equality to equal right and opportunity to make the best one can of one's life within one's capacity, without fear of injustice or oppression or threat of violence. But the evolution of American politics, with the distinct persistence of ethnic and religious groups, has added an extremely significant new disagreement to that classless idea. It is increasingly demanded that the distribution of success and failure within one group be roughly comparable to that within other groups. It is not enough that all individuals start out on even terms, if the member of one group almost always end up well in front, and those of another far to the rear. This is what ethnic politics are all about in America, and in the main, the American African demands are being put forth in the now traditional and established framework. Here a point of meaning must be grasped. The demand for equality of opportunity has been generally understood by Anglo-Americans as a demand for liberty, a demand not to be excluded from the complete competitions of life at the polling place, in scholarship examinations, at the personnel office, on the housing market. Liberty does, of course, demand that everyone be free to try his luck or test his skill in such matters. But these opportunities do not necessarily produce equality. On the contrary, to the point that winners indicate losers, equality of opportunity almost ensures inequality of results. The point of meaning is that equality of opportunity now has a different meaning for the American Africans than it has for Anglo-Americans. It is not, or at least no longer, a demand for liberty alone, but also for equality in terms of group results. In Bayard-Rustin terms, it is now concerned not merely with removing the barriers to full opportunity, but with achieving the fact of equality. By equality, Rustin means a distribution of achievements among American Africans roughly comparable to that among Anglo-Americans. Bayard-Rustin. As Nathan Glazier has put it, the demand for economic equality is now not the demand for equal opportunities for the equally qualified, it is now the demand for equality of economic results. The demand for equality in education has also become a demand for equality results of outcomes. Nathan Glazier. Some parts of the new laws do guarantee results, in the sense that upon authorization and enforcement they bring about an objective that is an end in itself, example, Public Accommodations title of the Civil Rights Act. Other conditions are at once fatal and intermediary. The positions of the Civil Rights Act dealing with voting rights will achieve an objective that is an end in itself, but the exercise of those rights will no doubt lead to further enlargements of the freedom of the American African. But by and large, the programs that have been endorsed in the first phase of the American African Revolution, manpower retaining, the Job Corps, community action, etc., only makes opportunities available. They cannot ensure the outcome. The principal challenge of the next phase of the American African Revolution is to make certain that equality of results will now follow. If we do not, there will be no social peace in the United States for generations. The prospect for equality. The time, therefore, is at hand for an unflinching look at the present potential of American Africans to move from where they now are, to where they want and ought to be. There is no satisfactory way, at present, to measure social health or social pathology, the science of cause and effect of disease, within an ethnic or religious or geographical community. The data is few and uncertain, and conclusions drawn from them, including the conclusions that follow, are subject to the grossest error. Nevertheless, the opportunities, no less than the dangers, of the present moment, demand that an assessment be made. That being the case, it has to be said that there is a considerable body of evidence to support the conclusion that the American African social structure, in particular the American African family being battered and harassed by discrimination, injustice, and uprooting, is in the deepest trouble. While many young American Africans are moving ahead to unprecedented levels of achievement, many more are falling further and further behind. After an intensive study of the life of Central Harlem, the Board of Directors of Harlem Youth Opportunities Unlimited Incorporated summed up their findings in one statement: massive deterioration of the fabric of society and its institutions. It is the conclusion of this survey of the available national data that what is true of Central Harlem can be said to be true of the entire American African race in America. If this is so, it is the single most important social fact in the United States today. Chapter 2. The American African Family. At the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of the American African society is the deterioration of the American African family. It is the fundamental source of the weakness of the American African community at the present time. There is probably no single fact of American African life understood by Anglo-Americans. The American African situation is commonly perceived by Anglo-Americans in terms of the visible manifestation of discrimination and poverty, in part because American African protest is directed against such obstacle, and in part, no doubt, because these are facts which involve the action of attitudes of the Anglo-American community as well. It is more difficult, however, for Anglo-Americans to perceive the effect that 4 centuries of exploitations have had on the fabric of the American African society itself. Here the consequences of the historic injustices done to the American Africans are silent and hidden from view. But here is where the true injury has occurred. Unless this damage is repaired, all the effort to end discrimination and poverty and injustice will be futile. The role of the family in shaping character and ability is so pervasive as to be easily overlooked. The family is the basic social unit of American life. It is the basic socializing unit. By and large, adult conduct in society is learned as a child. A fundamental insight of psychoanalytic theory, for example, is that the child learns a way of looking at life in its early years, through which their later experience is viewed, and which profoundly shapes its adult conduct. It may be suggested that the reason family structure does not loom larger in public discussion of social issues is that people tend to assume that the nature of family life is about the same throughout American society. The mass media and the development of suburbia have created an image of the American family as a highly standardized phenomenon. It is therefore easy to assume that whatever it is that makes for differences among individuals or groups of individuals, it is not a different family structure. There is much truth to this. As with any other nation, Americans are producing a recognizable family system. But that process is not completed by any means. There are still, for example, important differences in family patterns surviving from the age of the Great European Migration to the United States, and these variations account for noticeable differences in the progress and assimilation of various ethnic and religious groups. A number of immigrant groups were characterized by unusually strong family bonds. These groups have characteristically progressed more rapidly than others. But there is one truly great gap in the family structure in the United States at present time, that is between the Anglo-American world in general and that of the American African. The Anglo-American family has achieved a high degree of stability and is maintaining that stability. By contrast, the family structure of lower-class American Africans is highly unstable, and in many urban centers is approaching complete breakdown. There is considerable evidence that the American African community is in fact dividing between a stable middle-class group that is steadily growing stronger and more successful, and an increasingly disorganized and disadvantaged lower-class group. There are indications, for example, that the middle-class American African family places a higher premium on family stability and the conserving of family resources than does the Anglo-American middle-class family. The discussion of this report is not, obviously, directed to the first group excepting as it is affected by the experiences of the second and important exceptions. There are 2 points to be noted in this context. First, the emergence and increasing visibility of an American African middle class may fascinate the nation into supposing that the circumstances of the remainder of the American African community are equally prosperous, whereas just the opposite is true at present, and is likely to continue so. Second, the lumping of all American Africans together in one statistical measurement very likely conceals the extent of the disorganization among the lower class groups. If the conditions are improving for one and deteriorating for the other, the resultant statistical advantages may show no change. Further, the statistics on the American African family and most other subjects treated in this report refer only to a specific point in time. They are a vertical measure of the situation at a given moment. They do not measure the experience of individuals over time. Thus, the average monthly unemployment rate for American African males for 2021 is recorded as 8.6%. But during 2021, the unemployment numbers for American Africans were higher and lower at in other periods. Similarly, for example, if 36% of American African children are living in broken homes at any specific moment, it is likely that a far higher proportion of American African children find themselves in that situation at one time or another in their lives. 30% of urban American African marriages are dissolved. Nearly 30% of American African women who have ever married are divorced, separated, or are living apart from their husbands. The rates are highest in the urban southern and western states, where rates vary for American African women who have ever married, are either divorced, separated, or have their husbands absent. In the urban cities, the proportion of husbands' absence is even higher. In New York City in 2021, it was 39%, not including divorces. Among ever-married non-Anglo-American women in the nation, the proportion with husbands present declined in every age group over the decades. Although similar decades occurred among Anglo-American females, the proportion of Anglo-American husbands present never dropped below 90% except for the first and last age group. Nearly 70% of American African births are now illegitimate. Both Anglo-American and American African illegitimacy rates have been increasing, although from dramatically different bases. The Anglo-American rate rose in 1971 while the American African rate declined. At a press conference on June 17, 1971, President Nixon, with his newly appointed drug authority at his side, declared drug abuse public enemy number one when America did not have a drug problem. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, he continued, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive. With that statement, the war on drugs began against the American Africans of the United States. It's not a coincidence that this happened when American African illegitimacy rates were beginning to decline. The number of illegitimate children per 1,000 live births increased among Anglo-Americans in the period between 1940 to 1963, but by 68 among non-Anglos. There are, of course, limits to the dependability of these statistics. There are almost certainly a considerable number of American African children who, although technically illegitimate, are in fact the offspring of stable unions. On the other hand, it may be assumed that many births that are in fact illegitimate are recorded otherwise. Probably the two opposite effects cancel each other out. In major cities, the non-Anglo-American illegitimacy rates are usually higher than the national average, and lately, the increase has been drastic. In the District of Columbia, the illegitimacy rate for non-Anglo-Americans grew drastically. The families into which children are born, and in which they spend the early part of childhood, have changed dramatically over the past several decades. Among the most notable changes is an increase in non-marital childbearing, that is, the percentage of all children born to unmarried parents. Recent estimates show that about 40% of births in the United States occur outside of marriage, up from 28% in 1990, Child Trends, 2016. This increase is consistent with changes in non-marital childbearing seen worldwide, Shami, 2017. New analyses by Child Trends indicate that the likelihood that a child will be born to unmarried parents varies substantially by the mother's current education level and by her race and ethnicity. In 2016, 28% of all births to non-Hispanic, non-Anglo-American women occurred outside of marriage, a figure that is almost twice as high as the 15% of births among this demographic that were non-marital in 1990. In 2016, 52% of all births to Hispanic women occurred outside of marriage, up from 34% in 1990, a more than 50% increase. The percent of births that occurred outside of marriage also increased for non-Hispanic American African women between 1990 and 2016, from 63 to 69%, a 9% increase, though a much lesser extent than for white and Hispanic women. A similar picture is disintegrating American Africans' marriage emerged from the divorce statistics. Lately divorces have increased for both Anglo-Americans and non-Anglo-American, but at a much greater rate for the latter. In 2000 the divorce rate for Anglo-Americans was 19%, and for non-Anglo-Americans, 40%. In 1940 both groups had a divorce rate of 2.2%. By 1964 the Anglo-American rate had risen to 3.6%, but the non-Anglo-American rate had reached 5.1%, much greater than the formerly equal Anglo-American rate. 60.2% of American African families are headed by females. As a direct result of this high rate of divorce, separation, and desertion, a very large percent of American African families are headed by females. While the percentage of such families among Anglo-Americans has been dropping, it has been rising among American Africans. The percent of non-Anglo-American families led by a female is more than double the percent for Anglo-Americans. Fatherless non-Anglo-American families increased, but held constant for Anglo-American families. It has been estimated that only very few American African children reach the age of 18, having lived all their lives with both their parents. Once again, this measure of family disorganization is found to be diminishing among Anglo-American families and increasing among American African families. The breakdown of the American African family has led to a startling increase in welfare dependency. Finally, the truth about welfare: how many American Africans versus how many Anglo-Americans? Most American African people believe that more Anglo-Americans are on welfare, and most Anglo-Americans believe that more American Africans are on welfare. So who's right? Well, here are the facts according to a 2016 report by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, U.S. Department of Commerce, Cato Institute. Number of Americans receiving welfare assistance, 110,489,000. Number of Americans receiving food stamps, 41,700,000. Number of Americans on unemployment insurance, 10,200,000. Percentage of the U.S. population on welfare, 35.4%. Total government spending on welfare annually, $131.9 billion. So how many American African versus Anglo-Americans? Well, believe it or not, the numbers are actually about the same. There are just about as many Anglo-Americans on welfare as there are American Africans. Percent of welfare recipients who are Anglo-American, 38.8%. Percent of welfare recipients who are American African, 39.8%. Asterisk: I like to add that percentage-wise, the numbers are the same, but when the size of the two populations are compared, Anglo-Americans far outnumber American Africans. Note, many people confuse these statistics. This does not mean that 38.8% of all Anglo-Americans and 39.8% of all American Africans are on welfare. It means that 39.8% of all the actual welfare recipients are American Africans, and 38.8% of all the welfare recipients are Anglo-Americans. And contrary to popular belief, a lot less immigrants are on welfare. Percent of welfare recipients who are Hispanic, 15.7%. Percent of welfare recipients who are Asian, 2.4%. Percent of welfare recipients who are other, 3.3%. Note, again, this does not mean that 15.7% of all Hispanic Americans and 2.4% of all Asian Americans are on welfare. It is referring to the percentage of welfare recipients. Those numbers might shock you, but the numbers don't lie, and these are federal government statistics. The majority of American African children receive public assistance under the U.S. welfare program at one point or another in their childhood. In 1956, 14% of American African children were receiving welfare assistance, as did 2% of Anglo children. 8% of Anglo children receive such assistance at some time, as do 56% of non-Anglo-American children, according to an extrapolation based on HEW data. Let it be noted, however, that out of a total of 1.8 million non-Anglo-American illegitimate children in the nation in 1961, 1.3 million were not receiving aid under the welfare program, although a substantial number have received aid at some time in their lives. Again, the situation may be said to be worsening. The welfare program, deriving from the long-established Mother's Aids program, was established in 1935. Principally to care for widows and orphans, although the legislation covered all children in homes deprived of parental support because one or both of their parents are absent or incapacitated. In the beginning, the number of welfare families in which the father was absent because of desertion was less than 1/3 of the total. Today it is 2/3 the total. That between 2/3 and 3/4 of the 50% increase. From 2019 to 2021 in the number of absent father families receiving welfare may be explained by an increase of broken homes in the population. A 1960 study of ADC in Cook County, Illinois stated, the typical ADC mother in Cook County was married and had children by her husband, who deserted, whereabouts are unknown, and he does not contribute to the support of his children. She is not free to remarry and has had an illegitimate child since her husband left. Almost 90% of the ADC families were American African. The steady expansion of this welfare program, as a public assistance programs in general, can be taken as a measure of the steady disintegration of the American African family structure over the past 3 generations in the United States. Chapter 3. The root of the problem. Slavery. The most perplexing question about American slavery, which has never been altogether explained, and which indeed most Americans hardly know exists, has been stated by Nathan Glazier as follows: why was American slavery the most awful the world has ever known? The only thing that can be said with certainty is that this is true, it was. American slavery was profoundly different from, and in its lasting effects on, individuals and their children, indescribably worse than any recorded servitude, ancient or modern. The peculiar nature of American slavery was noted by Alexis de Tocqueville and others, but it was not until 1948 that Frank Tannenbaum, a South American specialist, pointed to these striking differences between Brazilian and American slavery. The feudal, Catholic society of Brazil had a legal and religious tradition, which accorded the slave a place as a human being in the hierarchy of society, a luckless, miserable place, to be sure, but a place, nevertheless. In contrast, there was nothing in the tradition of English law or Protestant theology which could accommodate to the fact of human bondage. The slaves were therefore reduced to the status of chattels, often, no doubt, well cared for, even privileged chattels, but chattels, nevertheless. Glazier, also focusing on the Brazilian-United States comparison, continues. In Brazil, the slave had many more rights than the slave of the United States. He could legally marry, he could, indeed had to, be baptized and become a member of the Catholic Church. His family could not be broken up for sale, and he had many days on which he could either restore, earn money, or to buy his freedom. The government encouraged manumission, and the freedom of infants could often be purchased for a small sum at the baptismal. In short, the Brazilian slave knew he was a man, and that he differed in degree, not in kind, from his master. In the United States, the slave was totally removed from the protection of organized society. Compare the elaborate provisions for the protection of slaves in the Bible. His existence as a human being was given no recognition by any religious or secular agency. He was totally ignorant of and completely cut off from his past, and he was offered absolutely no hope for the future. Many more rights than the slave of the United States. He could legally marry, he could, indeed had to, be baptized and become a member of the Catholic Church. His family could not be broken up for sale, and he had many days on which he could either restore, earn money. His children could be sold, his marriage was not recognized, his wife could be violated or sold. There was something cosmic about calling the woman with whom the master permitted him to live a wife, and he could also be subject, without compensation, to frightful barbarities. There were presumably as many sadists among slave owners, men and women, as there are in other groups. The slave could not, by law, be taught to read or write. He could not practice any religion without the permission of his master, and could never meet with his fellows, for religious or any other purposes, except in the presence of an Anglo-American. And finally, if a master wishes to free him, every legal obstacle was used to thwart such action. This was not what slavery meant in the ancient world, in medieval and early modern Europe, or in Brazil, and the West Indies. More important, American slavery was also awful in its effects. If we compare the present situation of the American African with that of, let us say, Brazilian Africans, who were slaves 20 years longer, we begin to suspect that the differences are the result of very different patterns of slavery. Today, the Brazilian Africans are Brazilians, though most are poor and do the hard and dirty work of the country, as American Africans do in the United States. They are not cut off from society. They reach into its highest strata, merging there in smaller and smaller numbers, it is true, but with complete acceptance with other Brazilians of all kinds. The relations between Brazilian Africans and Anglo-Saxons in Brazil show nothing of the mass senselessness that governs in America. Stanley M. Elkins, drawing on the unusual behavior of the prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, drew an elaborate parallel between the two institutions. This thesis has been summarized as follows by Thomas F. Pettigrew. Both were closed systems, with little chance of release, emphasis on survival, and a single, ever-present authority. The profound personality change created by Nazi internment, as independently reported by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists who survived, was towards childishness and total acceptance of the SS guards as father figures, a condition strikingly similar to the Sambo exaggeration of the Southern slave. 19th century racist readily believed that the Sambo personality was simply an inborn racial type. Yet no African study of human data has ever shown any personality type resembling Sambo, and the concentration camps molded the equivalent personality pattern in a wide variety of Caucasian prisoners. Nor was Sambo merely a product of slavery in the abstract. The less devastating Latin American system never developed such a type. Extending this line of reasoning, psychologists point out that slavery in all its forms sharply lowered the need for achievement in slaves. Africans in bondage, stripped of their African heritage, were placed in a completely different role. All of their reward came, not from individual initiative and enterprise, but from absolute obedience, a situation that severely depresses the need for achievement among all peoples. Most important of all, slavery corrupted family life. Since many slave owners neither fostered Christian marriage among their slaves couples nor hesitated to separate them on the auction block, the slave household often developed a fatherless, matriarchal, mother-centered pattern. The Reconstruction. With the emancipation of the slaves, the American African family began to form in the United States on a widespread scale. But it did so in an atmosphere markedly different from that which produced the American Anglo family. The American African was given liberty, but not equality. Life remained hazardous and marginal. Of the greatest importance, the American African male, particularly in the South, became an object of intense hostility, an attitude unquestionably based in some measure on fear. When Jim Crow made its appearance towards the end of the 19th century, it may be speculated that it was the American African male who was most humiliated. Thereby, the male was more likely to use public facilities, which rapidly became segregated once the process began, and just as important, segregation, and the submissiveness it extracts, is surely more destructive to the male than to the female personality. Keeping the American African in their place can be translated as keeping the American African male in his place. The female was not a threat to anyone. Unquestionably, these events worked against the emergence of a strong father figure. The very essence of the male animal, from the bantam rooster to the four-star general, is destruct. Indeed, in 19th century America, a particular type of exaggerated male boastfulness became almost a national style. Not for the American African male. The strutting American African male was hung. In this situation, the American African family made but little progress towards the middle-class pattern of the present time. Margaret Mead has pointed out that while in every known human society, everywhere in the world, the young male learns that when he grows up, one of the things which he must do in order to be a full member of society is to provide food for some female and her young. This pattern is not immutable, however, it can be broken, even though it has always eventually reasserted itself. Within the family, each new generation of young males learn the appropriate nurturing behavior and superimpose upon their biological given maleness this learned parental role. When the family breaks down, as it does under slavery, under certain forms of indentured labor and serfdom, in periods of extreme social unrest, during wars, revolutions, famines, and epidemics, or in periods of abrupt transition from one type of economy to another, this delicate line of transmission is broken. Men may struggle badly in these periods, during which the primary unit may again become mother and child, the biologically given, and the special conditions under which man has held his social traditions in trust are violated and distorted. E. Franklin Fraser makes clear that at the time of emancipation American African women were already accustomed to playing the dominant role in family and marriage relations, and that this role persisted in the decades of rural life that followed. Urbanization. Country life and city life are profoundly different. The gradual shift of American society from a rural to an urban basis over the past century and a half has caused abundant strains, many of which are still much in evidence. When this shift occurs suddenly, drastically, in 1 or 2 generations, the effect is immensely disruptive of traditional social patterns. It was this abrupt transition that produced the wild Irish slums of the 19th century Northeast. Drunkenness, crime, corruption, discrimination, family disorganization, and juvenile delinquency were the routines of the era. In our own time, the same sudden transition has produced the American African slums different from, but hardly better than its predecessors, and fundamentally the result of the same process. American Africans are now more urbanized than American Anglos. Urban population as percent of total, by color, 1960. American Anglo-American African. 69.573.2. Source, U.S. Census of Populations 1960. Urban population as percent of total, by color, 2020. American Anglo-Hispanic American African Asian. 57.818.712.46.0. American African families in cities are more frequently headed by a woman than those in the country. The difference between the American Anglo and the American African proportions of family headed by a woman is greater in the city than in the country. Percent of American African families headed by female, 2020. American African, 64%. American Indian, 43%. Latino, 34%. Non-Latino Anglo, 26%. Asian, 22%. The promise of the city has so far been denied to the majority of the American African, and most particularly the American African family. In 1939, E. Franklin Fraser described its plight movingly in that part of the American African family entitled In the City of Destruction. The impact of hundreds of thousands of rural Southern American Africans upon northern metropolitan communities presents a bewildering spectacle. Striking contrast in levels of civilization and economic well-being among these newcomers to modern civilization seem to baffle any attempt to discover order and direction in the mode of life. In many cases, of course, the dissolution of the simple family organization has begun before the family reaches the northern city. But, if these families have managed to preserve their integrity until they reach the northern city, poverty, ignorance, and color force them to seek homes in deteriorated slum areas from which particularly all institutional life has disappeared. Hence, at the same time that these simple rural families are losing their internal structure, they are being freed from the controlling force of public opinion and institutions. Family desertion among American African in cities appears, then, to be one of the inevitable consequences of the impact of urban life on the simple family organization and folk culture which the American African has evolved in the rural South. The distribution of desertion in relation to the general economic of cultural organization of American African communities that have grown up in our American cities shows in a striking manner the influence of selective factors in the progress of adjustment to the urban environment. Fraser concluded his classic study, The American African Family, with the prophecy that the travail of civilization is not yet ended. First, it appears that the family, which evolved within the isolated world of the American African, will become increasingly disorganized. modern means of communications will break down the isolation of the world, of the American African, and, as long as the bankrupt system of Southern agriculture exists, American African families will continue to seek a living in the towns and cities of the country. They will crowd the slum areas of southern cities or make their way to northern cities where their family life will become disrupted, and their poverty will force them to depend upon charity. American children who live in broken homes by percent, 1960. Anglo-American, non-Anglo-American. 10%, 34%. American children who live in broken homes by percent, 2020. American African, 57.6. Latino, 31.2. American Anglo, 20.7. In the Index of Family Pathology, Divorce, Separation, and Desertion, Female Family Head, Children in Broken Homes, and Illegitimacy, the gap between the urban and rural environment for American African families is unmistakable. Harlem, in which the American African began to move early in the 20th century, is the center and symbol of the urban life of the American African. Conditions in Harlem are not bad, they are probably better than in most American African ghettos. The social disorganization of Central Harlem, comprising 10 health areas, was thoroughly documented by the Harrier Report, save for the legitimate rates. These have now been made available to the Labor Department by the New York City Department of Health. There could hardly be a more dramatic demonstration of the crumbling, the breaking of the family structure on the urban frontier. Unemployment and poverty. The impact of unemployment on the American African family, and particularly on the American African male, is the least understood of all the developments that have contributed to the present crisis. There is little analysts because there has been almost no inquiry. Unemployment, for whites and non-Anglo-Americans alike, has on the whole been treated as an economic phenomenon, with almost no attention paid for at least a quarter century to social and personal consequences. In 1940, Edward White Bakke described the effects of unemployment on family structure in terms of 6 stages of adjustment. Although the families studied were Anglo-American, the pattern would clearly seem to be a general one, and apply to American African families as well. The first 2 stages end with exhaustion of credit and the entry of the wife into the labor force. The father is no longer the provider, and the elder children become resentful. The third stage is the critical one of commencing a new day-to-day existence. At this point, 2 women are in charge. Consider the fact that relief investigators or caseworkers are normally women and deal with the housewife. Already suffering a loss in prestige and authority in the family because of his failure to be the chief breadwinner, the male head of the family feels deeply this obvious transfer of planning for the family's well-being to 2 women, one of them an outsider. His role is reduced to that of driving his wife to and from the welfare office. If the family makes it through this stage, Bakke finds that it is likely to survive, and the rest of the process is one of adjustment. The critical element of adjustment was not welfare payments, but work. Having observed our family under conditions of unemployment with no public help, or with that help coming from direct resources, and from work relief, we are convinced that after the exhaustion of self-produced resources, work relief is the only type of assistance which can restore the strained bonds of family relationship in a way which promises the continued function of that family in meeting the responsibilities imposed upon it by our culture. Work is precisely the one thing the American African family head in such circumstances has not received over the past generations. The fundamental, overwhelming fact is the American African unemployment, with the exception of a few years during World War II and the Korean War, has continued at disastrous levels for 85 years. Once again, this is particularly the case in the northern urban areas to which the American African population has moved. The 1930 census, before the Depression was in full swing, showed American African employment at 6.1%, as against 6.6% for American Anglos. But taking out the southern reversed of the relationship, American Anglo 7.4%, American African 11.5%. By 1940, the 2-to-1 and constantly rising American Anglo/American African unemployment relationship that persists to this day had clearly emerged. Taking out the southern again, American Anglos were 14.8%, American Africans 29.7%. Since 1929, the American African worker has been tremendously affected by the movements of the business cycle of unemployment. He has been hit worse by declines than American Anglos, and proportionally helped more by recoveries. From 1951 to 1963, the level of American African male unemployment was on a long-run rising trend, where at the same time following the short-run ups and downs of the business cycle. During the same period, the number of broken families in the American African world was also on a long-run rise, with intermediate ups and downs. A glance at the chart on page 31, 32, and 33 reveals that the series move in the same direction up and down together, with a long-run rising trend, but that the peaks and lows are 1 year out of phase. Thus unemployment peaks 1 year before broken families, and so on. By plotting these series in terms of deviation from trend, and moving the unemployment curve 1 year ahead, we see the clear revelation of the 2 otherwise seemingly unrelated series of events. The cyclical swing in unemployment have their counterparts in increases and decreases in separations. The effect of recession employment on divorces further illustrates the economic root of the problem. The Anglo-American divorce rates dipped slightly in high unemployment years like 1954, 1955, 1958, 1961, and 1962. Divorce is expensive. Those without money resort to separation or desertion. While divorce is not a desirable goal for a society, it recognizes the importance of marriage and family, and for children, some family continuity and support is more likely when the institution of the family has been so recognized. The conclusion from these and similar data is difficult to avoid. During times when jobs were reasonably plentiful, although at no time during this period, say perhaps the first 2 years, did the unemployment rate for American African males drop to anything like a reasonable level, the American African family became stronger and more stable. As jobs became more and more difficult to find, the stability of the family became more and more difficult to maintain. This relation is clearly seen in terms of the legitimacy rates of census tracts in the District of Columbia compared with male unemployment rates in the same neighborhoods. In 1963, a prosperous year, 29.2% of all American African men in the labor force were unemployed at some time during the year. Almost half of these men were out of work 15 weeks or more. The impact of poverty on American African family structure is no less obvious, although again it may not be widely acknowledged. There would seem to be an American tradition, rural in its origin, but reinforced by attitudes of urban immigrant groups, to the effect that family mortality and stability decline as income and social position rise. Over the years, this may have provided some consolation to the poor, but there is little evidence that it is true. On the contrary, higher family incomes are unmistakably associated with greater family stability. Which comes first may be a matter of assumption, but the combination of the two characteristics is unmistakable. The American African family is no exception. In the District of Columbia, for example, census tracts with median income over $80,000 had an illegitimacy rate one-third that of tracts in the category under $40,000. The wage system. The American wage system is conspicuous in the degree to which it provides high income for individuals, but is rarely adjusted to ensure the family, as well as individual needs, are met. Almost without exception, the social welfare and social insurance system of other industrial democracies provide for some adjustment or supplement of a worker's income to provide for the extra expenses of those with families. American arrangements do not, save for income tax deductions. The federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, up only $6 since 1956, provides a basic income for an individual, but an income well below the poverty line for a couple, much less a family with children. The 1965 economic report of the presidents revised the data on the number of persons living in poverty in the United States to take account of the varying needs of families of different sizes. The resulting revision illustrates the significance of family size. Using these criteria, the number of poor families is smaller, but the number of large families who are poor increases, and the number of children in poverty rises by more than one-third. This means that one-fourth of the nation's children live in families that are poor. A third of these children belonged to families in which the father was not only present, but was employed the full year round. In overall terms, median family incomes is lower for large families than for small families. Families of 6 or more children have median incomes 24% below families with 3. It may be added that 47% of young men who failed the selective service education test come from families of 6 or more. During the 1950 to 60 decade of heavy American African migration to the cities of the North and West, the ratio of non-Anglo-American and Anglo-American family income in cities increased from 57 to 63%. Corresponding declines in the ratio in the rural non-farm and farm areas kept the national ratio virtually unchanged. But between 1960 and 1963, median non-Anglo-American families' income slipped from 55 to 53% of Anglo-American income. The drop occurred in 3 regions, with only the South, where a larger proportion of American African families have more than one earner, showing a slight improvement. Ratio of non-Anglo-American to Anglo family median income, the United States and region, 1960 to 63. 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963. 55%, 53%, 53%, 53%. Because in general terms, American African families have the largest number of children and the lowest incomes, many American African fathers literally cannot support their families because the father is either not present, is unemployed, or makes such a low wage, the American African woman goes to work. 56% of American African women, aged 25 to 64, are in the workplace against 42% of white women. This dependence on the mother's income undermines the position of the father and deprives the children of the kind of attention, particularly in school matters, which is now a standard feature in middle-class upbringing. The dimensions grow. The dimensions of the problem of the American Africans are compounded by the present extraordinary growth in American African population. At the founding of the nation, and into the first decade of the 19th century, 1 American in 5 was an American African. The proportion declined steadily until it was only 1 in 10 by 1920, where it held until the 1950s, when it began to rise. Since 1950, the American African population has grown at a rate of 2.4% per year, compared with 1.7% for the total population. If this rate continues, within 7 years, 1 American in 8 will be non-Anglo-American. These changes are the result of a declining American African death rate, now approaching that of the nation generally, and a fertility rate that grew steadily during the post-war period. By 1959, the ratio of Anglo-American to non-Anglo-American fertility rates reached 1 minute and 1.42 seconds. Both the Anglo and non-Anglo fertility rates have declined since 1959, but the differential has not narrowed. Family size increased among non-Anglo-American families between 1950 and 1960, as much for those without fathers as for those with fathers. Average family size changed little among Anglo families, with a slight increase in the size of husband-wife families balanced by a decline in the size of families with fathers. American African women not only have more children, but have them earlier. Thus in 1960, there were 1,247 children ever born per thousand ever married non-Anglo women 15 to 19 years of age, as against only 725 among Anglo women, a ratio of 1.7 to 1. The American African fertility rate overall is now 1.4 times the Anglo-American, but what might be called the generation rate is 1.7 times the Anglo-American. Fertility rates for non-Anglo-American women are a third higher than those for Anglo-American women. This population growth must inevitably lead to an inconceivable crisis in American African unemployment. The most conspicuous failure of the American social system in the past 60 years has been its inadequacy in providing jobs for American African youth. Thus, in January 1965, the unemployment rate for American African teenagers stood at 29%. The problem has now become steadily more serious. During the rest of the 1960s, the non-Anglo civilian population 14 years of age and over will increase by 20%, more than double the Anglo race. The non-Anglo labor force will correspondingly increase 20% in the next 6 years, double the rate of increase in the non-Anglo labor force of the past decade. As with the population as a whole, there is much evidence that children are being born most rapidly in those American African families with the least financial resources. This is an ancient pattern, but because the needs of children are greater today, it is very possible that the education and opportunity gap between the offspring of those families and those of stable middle-class unions is not closing, but is growing wider. This cycle is at work. Too many children too early make it most difficult for the parents to finish school. In February 1963, 38% of the Anglo girls who dropped out of school did so because of marriage or pregnancy, as against 49% of non-Anglo girls. An Urban League study in New York reported that 44% of girls dropped out of school did so due to pregnancy. Low education levels in turn produce low income levels, which deprive children of many opportunities, and so the cycle repeats itself. Chapter 4. The Tangle of Chapter 4. The Tangle of Pathology. That the American African has survived at all is extraordinary. A lesser people might simply have died out, as indeed others have. That the American African community has not only survived, but in this political generation has entered national affairs as a moderate, humane, and constructive national force in the highest testament to the healing powers of the democratic ideal and the creative vitality of the American African people. But it may not be supposed that the American African community has not paid a fearful price for the incredible mistreatment to which it has been subjected over the past 4 centuries. In essence, the American African community has been forced into a matriarchal structure which, because it is so out of line with the rest of the American society, seriously retards the progress of the group as a whole, and imposes a crushing burden on the American African male and, in consequence, on a great many African American women as well. There is, presumably, no special reason why a society in which males are dominant in family relationships is to be preferred to a matriarchal arrangement. However, it is clearly a disadvantage for a minority, smaller, group to be operating on one principle, while the great majority, larger group, of the population, and the one with the most advantage to begin with, is operating on another. This is the present situation of the American African. Ours is a society which presumes male leadership in private and public affairs. The arrangements of society facilitate such leadership and rewards it. A subculture, such as that of the American African, in which this is not the pattern, is placed at a distinct disadvantage. Here an earlier word of caution should be repeated. There is much evidence that a considerable number of American African families have managed to break out of the tangle of pathology and to establish themselves as stable units, according to patterns of American society in general. E. Franklin Fraser has suggested that the middle-class American African family is, if anything, more patriarchal and proactive on its children than the general run of such families. Given equal opportunities, the children of these families will perform as well, or better than their Anglo peers. They need no help from anyone, and ask none. While this phenomenon is not easily measured, one index is that middle-class American Africans have even fewer children than middle-class Anglos, indicating a desire to conserve the advances that have been made and to ensure that their children do as well or better. American African women who marry early to uneducated laborers have more children than white women in the same situation. American African women who marry at the common age for the middle class to educated men doing technical or professional work have only 4/5 as many children as their Anglo counterparts. It may be estimated that as much as half of the American African community falls into the middle class. However, the remaining half is in desperate and deteriorating circumstances. Moreover, because of the housing segregation, it is immensely difficult for the stable half to escape from the cultural influences of the unstable one. The children of middle-class American Africans often as not must grow up in, or next to the slums, an experience almost unknown to Anglo middle-class children. They are therefore constantly exposed to the pathology of the disturbed group and constantly in danger of being drawn into it. It is for this reason that the propositions put forth in this study may be thought of as having a more or less general application. In a word, most American African youth are in danger of being caught up in the tangle of pathology that affects their world, and probably a majority are so entrapped. Many of those who escape do so for one generation only. As things now are, their children may have to run the gauntlet all over again. That is not the least vicious aspect of the world that the American Anglo has made for the American African. Obviously, not every instance of social pathology affecting the American African community can be traced to the weakness of family structure. If, for example, organized crime in the American African community were not, in large, controlled by Anglo-Americans, there would be more capital accumulation among American Africans, and therefore probably more American African business enterprises. If it were not for the hostility and fear many American Anglos exhibit towards American Africans, they in turn would be less affected by hostility and fear, and so on. There is no one American African community. There is no one American African problem. There is no one solution. Nevertheless, at the center of the tangle of pathology is the weakness of the family structure. Once or twice removed, it will be found to be the principal source of most of the deviant, inadequate, or antisocial behavior that did not establish, but now serves to perpetuate the cycle of poverty and deprivation. It was by destroying the American African family under slavery that the American Anglo broke the will of the American African people. Although that will has reasserted itself in our time, it is a resurgent doomed to frustration unless the viability of the American African family is restored. Matriarchy. A fundamental fact of American African family life is the often reverse roles of husband and wife. Robert O. Blood Jr. and Donald N. Wolfe, in a study of Detroit families, wrote that American African husbands have unusual low power. And while this is characteristic of all low-income families, the pattern pervades the American African social structure, the compilated result in discrimination in jobs, the segregated housing, and the poor schooling of American African men. In 44% of the American African families studied, the wife was dominant, as against 20% of Anglo wives. Whereas the majority of the Anglo families are equalitarian means, the largest percentage of American African families are dominated by the wife. The matriarchal pattern of so many American African families reinforces itself over the generations. This process begins with education. Although the gap appears to be closing at the moment, for a long while, American African females were better educated than American African males, and this remains true today for the American African population as a whole. Educational attainment of the civilian non-institutional population, 18 years of age and older, March 1964. Anglo-American male 12.1. Anglo-American female 12.1. Non-Anglo male 9.2. Non-Anglo female 10.0. The difference in education attainment between non-Anglo men and women in the labor force is even greater. It lags 1.1 years behind women. The disparity in educational attainment of male and female youth aged 16 to 21 who were out of school in February 1963 is striking. Among the non-Anglo-American males, 66.3% were not high school graduates, compared with 55% of the females. A similar difference existed at the college level, with 4.5% of the males having completed 1 to 3 years of college compared to 7.3% of the females. The poor performance of the male in school exists from the very beginning, and the magnitude of the difference was documented by the 1960 census in statistics on the number of children who have fallen behind one or more grades. Below the typical grade 4 children of the same age, the boys have been more frequently falling behind at every age level. Anglo boys also lag behind Anglo girls, but at a differential of 1 to 6 percentage points. Percent of non-Anglo youth enrolled in school who are 1 or more grades behind. Made for age, by sex, 1960. Age male-female. 7 to 9 7.85.8. 10 to 13 25.0 17.1. 14 to 15 35.5 24.8. 16 to 17 39.4 27.2. 18 and 19 57.3 46.0. In 1960, 39% of all Anglo-American persons 25 years of age and over who had completed 4 or more years of college were women. 53% of the non-Anglo-Americans who had attained this level were women. However, the gap is closing. By October 1963, there were slightly more American African men in college than women. Among Anglo-Americans, there were almost twice as many men as women enrolled. There is much evidence that American African females are better students than their male counterparts. Daniel Thompson of Dillard University, in a private communication on January 9, 1968, writes, "As low as is the aspiration level among low-class American African girls, it is considerably higher than among the boys. For example, I have examined the honor rolls of American African high schools for about a 10-year period. As a rule, from 75 to 90% of all American African honor students are girls. Fall enrollment of civilian non-institutional population in college, by color and sex October 1963. Color and sex population, 14 to 34 number enrolled percent of youth 14 to 34. Non-Anglo. Male 2,884 149 5.2. Female 3,372 137 4.1. Anglo-American. Male 21,700 2,599 12.0. Female 20,613 1,451 7.0. Dr. Thompson reports that 70% of all applications for the National Achievement Scholarship Program financed by the Ford Foundation for Outstanding American African High School graduates are girls, despite special efforts by high school principals to submit the names of boys. The finalists for this new program for Outstanding American African students were recently announced. Based on an inspection of the names, about 43% of all these 639 finalists were male. However, in the regular National Merit Scholarship Program, males receive 67% of the 1964 scholarship awards. Inevitably, these disparities have carried over to the area of employment and income. In 1 out of 4 American African families where the husband is present as an earner, and someone else in the family works, the husband is not the principal earner. The comparable figure for American Anglos is 18%. More important, it is clear that American African females have established a strong position for themselves in white-collar and professional employment, precisely the area of the economy which are growing most rapidly, and to which the highest prestige is accorded. The President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, making a preliminary report on employment in 1964 of over 16,000 companies with nearly 5,000 employees, revealed this pattern with dramatic emphasis. In this workforce, American African males outnumber American African females by a ratio of 4 to 1. Yet American African males represent only 1.2% of all males in white-collar occupations, while American African females represent 3.1% of the total female white-collared workforce. American African males represent 1.1% of all male professions, whereas American African females represent roughly 6% of all female professionals. Again, in technician occupations, American African males represent 2.1% of all male technicians, while American African females represent roughly 10% of all female technicians. It would appear, therefore, that there are proportionally 4 times as many American African females in significant white-collar jobs than American African males. Although it is evident that office and clerical jobs account for approximately 50% of all American African female white-collared workers, it is significant that 6 out of every 100 American African females are in professional jobs. This is subsequently similar to the rate of all females in such jobs. Approximately 7 out of every 100 American African females are in technical jobs. This exceeds the proportion of all females in technical jobs, approximately 5 out of every 100. American African females in skilled jobs are almost the same as that of all females in such jobs. 9 out of every 100 American African males are in skilled occupations, while 21 out of 100 of all males are in such jobs. This pattern is to be seen in a federal government, where special efforts have been made recently to ensure equal employment opportunity for American Africans. These efforts have been notably successful in departments such as labor, where some 19% of employees are now American African. A not so disproportionate percentage, given the composition of the workforce in the area where the main department offices are located. However, it may well be that these efforts have redounded mostly to the benefit of American African women, and may even have accentuated the comparative disadvantage of the American African male. 70% of the American African employees of the Department of Labor are women, as contrasted with only 42% of the Anglo employees. Among non-professional Labor Department employees, where the most employment opportunities exist for all groups, American African women outnumber American African men 4 to 1, and average almost 1 grade higher in classification. The testimony to the effects of these patterns in the American African family structure is widespread, and hardly to be doubted. Whitney Young. Historically, in the matriarchal American male society, mothers made sure that if one of their children had a chance for higher education, the daughter was the one to pursue it. The effects on family functioning and role performance of this historical experience, economic deprivation, is what you might predict. Both as a husband and as a father, the American African male is made to feel inadequate, not because he is unlovable or unaffectionate, lacks intelligence, or even a gray flannel suit. But in a society that measures a man by the size of his paycheck, he doesn't stand very tall in a comparison with his American Anglo counterpart. To this situation, he may react with withdrawal, bitterness towards society, aggression, both within the family and racial groups, self-hatred, or crime. Or he may escape through a number of avenues that help him to lose himself in fantasy in order to compensate for his low status through a variety of exploits. Whitney Young. Thomas Pettigrew. The American African wife in this situation can easily become disgusted with her financially dependent husband, and her rejection of him further alienates the male from family life. Disillusioned by their experiences with men, many American African mothers often act to perpetuate the mother-centered pattern by taking a greater interest in their daughters than their sons. Thomas Pettigrew. Deton Brooks. In a matriarchal structure, the women are transmitting the culture. Deton Brooks. Dorothy Height. If the American African woman has a major underlying concern, it is the status of the American African man and his position in the community and his need for feeling himself an important person, free and able to make his contribution in the whole society in order that he may strengthen his home. Dorothy Height. Duncan M. McIntyre. The American African literacy rate always has been high, about 8 times the American Anglo rate in 1940 and somewhat higher today, even though the Anglo-American literacy rate also is climbing. The American African statistics are symptomatic of some old socioeconomic problems, not the least of which are unemployment among American African men and compensating higher labor force propensity among American African women. Both operate to enlarge the mother's role, undercutting the status of the male and making many American African families essentially matriarchal. The American African man's uncertain unemployment prospects, matriarchy, and the high cost of divorces combine to encourage desertion. The poor man's divorce increases the number of couples not married, and thereby also increases the American African illegitimacy rates. In the meantime, higher American African birth rates are increasing the non-Anglo population, while migration into cities like Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. is making the public assistance role in such cities heavily, even predominantly American African. Robin M. Williams, Jr. in a study of Elmira, New York. Only 57% of American African adults reported themselves as married spouse present, as compared to 78% of native Anglo-American Gentiles, 91% of Italian American, and 96% of Jewish immigrants. Of the 93% unmarried American African youths interviewed, 22% did not have their mother living in the household with them, and 42% reported that their father was not living in their home. 1/3 of the youth did not know their father's present occupation, and 2/3 of a sample of 150 American African adults did not know what the occupation of their father's father had been. 40% of the youth said that they had brothers and sisters living in other communities. Another 40% reported relatives living in their homes who were not parents, siblings, or grandparents. Robin M. Williams, Jr. The failure of the youth. Williams account the American African youth growing up with little knowledge of their fathers, less of their father's occupation, still less of family occupational traditions, is in sharp contrast to the experiences of the Anglo child. The Anglo-American family, despite their variance, remains a powerful agency not only for transmitting property from one generation to the next, but also for transmitting no less valuable contracts with the world of education and work. In an earlier age, the carpenters, Wainwrights, weavers, mercers, farmers, smiths, etc., acquired their names as well as their trades from their fathers and grandfathers. Children today still learn the patterns of work from their fathers, even though they may no longer go into the same job. Anglo-American children without fathers at least perceive all about them the pattern of men working. American African children without fathers flounder and fail. Not always, to be sure, the American African community produces its share, very possibly more than its share, of young people who have the something extra that carries them over the worst obstacles. But such a person is always a minority. The common run of young people in a group faces serious obstacles to success, but do not succeed. A prime index of the disadvantage of American African youth in the United States is their consistently poor performance on the mental test that are a standard means of measuring ability and performance in the present generation. There is absolutely no question of any genetic differential. Intelligence potential is distributed among American African infants in the same proportion and pattern as among Islanders or Chinese or any other group. American society, however, impairs the American African's potential. The statement of the Harrier report that there is no basic disagreement over the fact that Central Harlem students are performing poorly in school may be taken as true of American African slum children throughout the United States. 8th grade children in Central Harlem have a median IQ of 87.7, which means that perhaps 1/3 of the children are scoring at levels curiously near to those of retardation. IQ declines in the first decade of life, raising only slightly thereafter. The effect of broken families on the performance of American African youth has not been extensively measured, but studies that have been made show an unmistakable influence. Martin Deutsch and Bert Brown, investigating intelligence tests differences between American Africans and Anglos 1st and 5th grades on different social classes, found that there is a direct relationship between social class and IQ. As the one rises, so does the other, but more for American Anglos than American Africans. This is surely a result of housing segregation, referred to earlier, which makes it difficult for middle-class American African families to escape the slums. The authors explained that it is much more difficult for the American African to attain identical middle or upper middle class status with American Anglos, and the social class graduations are less marked for American Africans because American Africans' life in a caste society is considerably more homogeneous than is life with a majority group. Mean intelligence scores of American African children by school, grade, social class, and by presence of father. Social class in school: grade father present, father absent. Lowest social class level. Grade 1 95.287.8. Grade 5 92.785.7. Middle school class level. Grade 1 98.792.8. Grade 5 92.992.0. Therefore, the authors looked for background variables other than social class, which might explain the differences. One of the most striking differences between the American African and Anglo groups is the consistently high frequency of broken homes and resulting family disorganization in the American African group. Percent of father absent from the home. Lowest social class level, middle social class level, highest social class level. Anglo AM. African Anglo AM. African Anglo AM. African. 15.443.910.327.90.013.7. Further, they found that children from homes where fathers are present have significant higher scores than children in homes without fathers. Means intelligence scores. Fathers present 97.83. Father absent 90.79. The influence of the father's presence was then tested within the social classes and school grade for American Africans alone. They found that a significant trend within both grades at the lowest SBS social class level appears, and in no case is there a reversal of this trend. For males, females, and the combined group, the IQs of children with fathers in the home are always higher than those who have no fathers in the home. The authors say that broken homes may also account for some of the differences between American Africans and Anglo intelligence scores. The scores of 5th graders with fathers absent were lower than the scores of 1st graders with fathers absent, and while the authors points out that it is cross-sectional data and does not reveal the duration of the father's absence, what we might be tapping is the cumulative effect of fatherless years. This difference in ability to perform has its counterpart in statistics on actual school performance. Non-Anglo boys from families with both parents present are more likely to be going to school than boys with only one parent present, and enrollment rates are even lower when neither parent is present. When the boys from broken homes are in school, they do not do as well as the boys from whole families. Grade retardation is higher when only one parent is present, and highest when neither parent is present. The loneliness of the American African youth in making fundamental decisions about education is shown in the 1959 study of American African and Anglo dropouts in Connecticut high schools. Only 29% of the American African male dropouts discussed their decision to drop out of school with their fathers, compared with 65% of Anglo males. 38% of the American African males were from broken homes. In fact, 26% of the American African males did not discuss this major decision in their lives with anyone at all, compared to only 8% of the Anglo males. A study of American African apprenticeship by the New York State Commission Against Discrimination in 1960 concluded: American African youth are seldom exposed to influences which can lead to apprenticeship. American Africans are not apt to have relatives, friends, or neighbors in skilled occupations. Nor are they likely to be in secondary schools where they receive encouragement and direction from alternate role models. Within the minority community, skilled American African models after whom the American African youth might pattern himself are rare, whilst substitute sources which could provide the direction, encouragement, resources, and information needed to achieve skilled craft standings are non-existent. Percent of non-Anglo males enrolled in school who are one or more grades below made for age, by age group and present of parents, 1960. Age, both parent, one parent, no parent. 7 to 9 years, 7.5, 7.7, 9.6. 10 to 13, 23.8, 25.8, 30.6. 14 to 15, 34.0, 36.3, 40.9. 16 to 17, 37.6, 40.9, 44.1. 18 to 19, 60.6, 65.9, 46.1. Percent of non-Anglo males enrolled in school, by age and presence of parents, 1960. Age, both parent, one parent, no parent. 5 years. 41.7, 44.2, 34.3. 6 years. 79.3, 78.7, 73.8. 7 to 9 years, 96.1, 95.3, 93.9. 10 to 13, 96.2, 95.5, 93.0. 14 to 15, 91.8, 89.9, 85.0. 16 to 17, 78.0, 72.7, 63.2. 18 to 19, 46.5, 40.0, 32.3. Delinquency and crime. The combined impact of poverty, failure, and isolation among American African youth has met a predictable outcome in the disastrous delinquency and crime rate. In a typical pattern of discrimination, American African children in all public and private institutions are a smaller proportion of all children than their proportion of the population, although their needs are clearly greater. On the other hand, American Africans represent a third of all youth in schools for juvenile delinquents. Children in homes for dependent and neglected children, 1960. Number percent. Anglo-American 64,807, 88.4. American African 6,148.4. Other races 2,359, 3.2. All races 73,306, 100.0. It is probable that at present, a majority of the crime against the person, such as rape, murder, and aggravated assault, are committed by American Africans. There is, of course, no absolute evidence. Inference can only be made from arrest and prison population statistics. The data that follows unquestionably are biased against American Africans, who are aligned much more casually than our American Anglos, but it may be doubted that the bias is great enough to affect the general proportions. Number of arrests in 1963. Anglo-American African. Anglo-American African. Offenses charged total 31,988, 38,549. Murder and manslaughter 2,288, 2,948. Forcible rape 4,402, 3,935. Aggravated assault 25,298, 31,666. Again, on the urban frontier, the ratio is worse. 3 out of 5 arrests for these crimes were of American Africans in Detroit, the same proportions held. In 1960, 37% of all persons in federal and state prisons were American Africans. In that year, 56% of the homicide and 57% of the assault offenders committed to state institutions were American Africans. Number of city arrests, 1963. Anglo-American American African. Offenses charged total 24,805, 35,005. Number of city arrests, 1963. Anglo-American American African. Offenses charged total 24,805, 35,520. Murder, manslaughter 1,662, 2,593. Forcible rape 3,199, 3,570. Aggravated assault 19,944, 29,357. Number of city arrests 2019. Anglo-American American African. Offenses charged total 4,729,291,815,144. Murder, manslaughter 3,654,078. Forcible rape 11,588, 4,427. Robbery 56,305, 25,143. Aggravated assault 274,376, 169,467. The overwhelming number of offenses committed by American Africans are directed towards other American Africans. The cost of crime to the American African community is a combination of that to the criminal and to the victim. Some of the research on the effect of broken homes of delinquent behavior recently surveyed by Thomas F. Pettigrew in a profile of an American African is summarized below, along with several other studies of the question. Mary Diggs found that 75%, twice the expected ratio of Philadelphia American Africans delinquents who came before the court during 1948, did not live with both their natural parents. In predicting juvenile crime, Eleanor and Sheldon Blueg also found that a higher proportion of delinquent boys came from broken homes than non-delinquent boys came from broken homes. They identified 5 critical factors in the home environment that made a difference in whether boys would become delinquents: discipline of boy by father, supervision of boy by mother, affection of father by boy, affection of mother by boy, and cohesiveness of family. The quality of forming a united whole. In 1952, when the New York City Youth Board set out to test the validity of these 5 factors as predictors of delinquency, a problem quickly emerged. The Blueg sample consisted of Anglo-American boys of mainly Irish, Italian, Lithuanian, and English descent. However, the youth board group was 44% American African and 14% Puerto Rican. The frequency of broken homes within these groups was out of proportion to the total number of the delinquents in the population. In the majority of these cases, the father was usually never in the home at all, absent for the major proportion of the boy's life, or was present only on occasion. The final prediction table was reduced to 3 factors: supervision of boy by mother, discipline of the boy by mother, and family cohesiveness within what family in fact existed, but was nonetheless 85% accurate in predicting delinquency and 96% accurate in predicting non-delinquents. Researchers who have focused upon the good boy in high delinquency neighborhoods noted that they typically come from exceptionally stable, intact families. Recent psychological research demonstrates the personality effects of being reared in a disorganized home without a father. One study showed that children from fatherless homes seek immediate gratification of their desires far more than children with fathers present. Others revealed that children who hunger for immediate gratification are more prone to delinquency, along with other less social behavior. To psychologists, Pettigrew says maintaining that inability to delay gratification is a critical factor in immature, criminal, and neurotic behavior. Finally, Pettigrew discussed the evidence that a stable home is a crucial factor in counteracting the effects of racism upon American African personality. A warm, supportive home can effectively compensate for many of the restrictions the American African child faces outside of their community. Consequently, the type of home life an American African enjoys as a child may be far more crucial for the governing the influence of segregation upon the personality than the form that segregation takes, legal or informal, Southern or Northern. A Yale University study of youth in the lowest socioeconomic class in New Haven in 1950, whose behavior was followed through their 18th year, reveals that among the delinquents in the group, 38% came from broken homes, compared with 24% of non-delinquents. The President's Task Force on Manpower Conservation in 1963 found that of young men rejected for the draft for failure to pass the mental test, 42% of those with a court record came from broken homes, compared with 30% of those without court record. Half of all the non-Anglo-American rejected in the study, with a court record, came from broken homes. An explanation of the family background of 44,408 delinquency cases in Philadelphia between 1949 and 1954 documents the frequency of broken homes among delinquents. 62% of the American African delinquents and 36% of the Anglo-American delinquents were not living with both parents. In 1950, 33% of the non-Anglo-American children and 7% of the Anglo-American children in Philadelphia were living in homes without both parents. Repeaters were even more likely to be from broken homes than first offenders. The armed forces. The ultimate mark of inadequate preparation for life is the failure rate on the armed forces mental test. The armed forces qualification test is not quite a mental test, nor yet an education test. It is a test of ability to perform at an acceptable level of competence. It roughly measures ability that ought to be found in an average 7th or 8th grade student. A grown young man or woman who cannot pass this test is in trouble. 56% of American Africans fail it. This is a rate almost 4 times of the Anglo-American. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines conduct by far the largest and most important education and training activity of the federal government, as well as provide the largest single source of employment in the nation. Military service is disruptive in some respects. For those comparatively few who are killed or wounded in combat, or otherwise, the personal sacrifice is inestimable. But, on balanced service in the armed forces over the past quarter century, it has worked greatly to the advantage of those involved. The training and experience of military duty itself is unique. The advantages that have generally followed in the form of the GI Bill, mortgage guarantees, federal life insurance, civil service preference, veterans hospital, and veterans pension are singular, to say the least. Although services in the armed forces is at least nominally a duty of all male citizens coming of age, it is clear that the present system does not enable American Africans to serve in anything like the proportionate numbers. This is not a question of discrimination. Induction into the armed forces is based on a variety of objective tests and standards, but these tests nevertheless have the effect of keeping the number of African Americans disproportionately small. In 1963, the United States Commission on Civil Rights reported that a decade ago, American Africans constituted 8% of the armed forces. Today, 1965, they continue to constitute 8% of the armed forces. 2019, 17%. Total number of U.S. military personnel by race, 2019. Characteristic active duty women, active duty men. Anglo-American 54.08%, 69.86%. American African 28.92%, 16.94%. Hispanic 21.39%, 17.9%. Asian 4.97%, 4.43%. Other 1.39%, 1.16%. In 1964, American Africans constituted 11.8% of the population, but remained at 8% of the armed forces. The significance of the American African underrepresentation in the armed forces is greater than might at first be supposed. If American Africans were represented in the same proportion in the military as they are in the population, they would number 300,000 plus. This would be over 100,000 more than at present, using 1964 strength values. If the more than 100,000 employed American African men were to have gone into the military, the American African male unemployment rate would have been 7% in 1964 instead of 9.1%. In 1963, the Civil Rights Commission commented on the occupational aspect of military service for American Africans. American African enlisted men enjoy relatively better opportunities in the armed forces than in the civilian economy in every clerical, technical, and skill field for which the data permit comparison. There is, however, an even more important issue involved in military service for American Africans. Service in the United States Armed Forces is the only experience open to the American African in which he is truly treated as an equal, not as an American African equal to an Anglo-American, but as one man equal to any other man in the world, where the category American African and Anglo-American do not exist. If this is a statement of the ideal rather than reality, it is an idea that is close to realization. In food, dress, housing, pay, work, the American African in the armed forces is equal and is treated that way. There is another special quality about military service for American African men. It is an utterly masculine world. Given the strains of the disorganized and matriarchal family life in which so many American African youth come of age, the armed forces are a dramatic and desperately needed change, a world away from women, a world run by strong men of unquestioned authority, where discipline, if harsh, is nonetheless orderly and predictable, and where rewards, if limited, are granted on the basis of performance. The theme of a current Army recruiting message states it as clearly as can be. In the U.S. Army you can get to know what it means to feel like a man. At a Civil Rights Commission hearing in Mississippi, a witness testified that his Army service was in fact the only time I ever felt like a man. Yet a majority of American African youth, and probably 75% of Mississippi's American Africans, fail the selective service education test and are rejected. American Africans' participation in the armed forces would be less than it is, were it not for a proportionally larger share of voluntary enlistments and re-enlistments. Alienation. The term alienation may by now have been used in too many ways to retain a clear meaning, but it will serve to sum up the equally numerous ways in which large numbers of American African youth appear to be withdrawing from American society. One startling way in which this occurs is that the men are just not there when the census enumerator comes around. According to Bureau of Census population estimates for 1963, there are only 87 non-Anglo males for every 100 females in the 32 to 34 year age group. The ratio does not exceed 90 to 100 throughout the 25 to 45 year age bracket. In the urban Northwest, there are only 76 males per 100 females 20 to 24 years of age, and males as a percent of females are below 90% throughout all ages after 14. There are not really fewer men than women in the 20 to 40 age bracket. What obviously is involved is an error in counting. The surveyors simply do not find the American African men. Donald J. Bogue and his associates, who have studied the federal count of the American African man, place the error as high as 19.8% at age 28. A typical error of around 15% is estimated from age 19 through 43. Preliminary research in the Bureau of the Census of the 1960 enumeration has resulted in similar conclusions, although not necessarily the same estimates of the extent of the error. The American African man can be found at age 17 and 18. On the basis of birth records and moral records, the conclusion must be that he is there at age 19 as well. When the enumerators do find the American African male, his answers to the standard questions asked in the monthly unemployment survey often result in counting him as not in the labor force. In other words, American African male employment may in truth be somewhat greater than reported. The labor force participation rate of non-Anglo men have been falling since the beginning of the century and for the past decade have been lower than the rates for Anglo men. In 1964 the participation rates were 78% for Anglo men and 75.8% for non-Anglo men. Almost 1 percentage point of this difference was due to a higher proportion of non-Anglo men unable to work because of long-term physical or mental illnesses. It seems reasonable to assume that the rest of the difference is due to discouragement about finding a job. If non-Anglo male labor force participation rates were as high as the Anglo rates, there would have been 140,000 more non-Anglo males in the labor force in 1964. If we further assume that the 140,000 would have been unemployed, the unemployment rate for non-Anglo men would have been 11.5% instead of the recorded rate of 9%, and the ratio between the non-Anglo rate and the Anglo rate would have jumped from 2 to 1 to 2.4 to 1. Understated or not, the official unemployment rates for American Africans are almost unbelievable. The unemployment statistics for American African teenagers, 29% in January 1965, reflect the lack of training and opportunity in the greatest measure, but it may not be doubted that they also reflect a certain failure of nerve. Are you looking for a job? Secretary of Labor words ask a young man on a Harlem street corner. Why, was the reply. Richard A. Cloward and Robert Ontel have commented on this withdrawal in a discussion of the Mobilization of Youth project on the Lower East Side of New York. What commentary slum and minority youth probably lack that similar children in earlier periods possessed is not motivation but some minimal sense of competence. We are plagued in work with these youth by what appears to be a low tolerance for frustration. They are not able to absorb setbacks. Minor irritants and rebuffs are magnified out of all proportion to reality. Perhaps they react as they do because they are not equal to the world that confronts them, and they know it. And it is the knowing of that is devastating. Had the occupational structure remained intact, or had the educational program provided to them kept pace with occupational changes, the situation would be a different one. But it is not, and that is what we, and they have to contend with. Narcotic addiction is a characteristic form of withdrawal. In 1963, American Africans made up 54% of the addicted population of the United States. Although the Federal Bureau of Narcotics reports a decline in the American African proportion of new addicts, Harriet reports the addiction rate in central Harlem rose from 22.1 per 10,000 in 1955 to 40.4 in 1961. There is a larger fact about the alienation of American African youth than the tangle of pathology described by these statistics. It is a fact particularly difficult to grasp by an American Anglo person who have in recent years shown increasing awareness of American African problems. Until World War II it could be said that in general, the American African and Anglo-American world lived, if not together, at least side by side. Certainly they did, and do, in the South. Since World War II, however, the two worlds have drawn physically apart. The symbol of this development was the construction in the 1940s and 1950s of the vast American Anglo-middle and lower middle-class suburbs around all of the nation's cities. Increasingly, the inner cities have been left to American Africans who now share almost no community life with American Anglos. In turn, because of this new housing pattern, most of which has been financially assisted by the federal government, it is probable that the American school system has become more, rather than less segregated in the past 2 decades. 1965. School integration has not occurred in the South, where a decade after Brown versus Board of Education, only 1 American African in 9 is attending school with American Anglo children. 1965, and in the North, despite strenuous official efforts, neighborhoods, and therefore schools, are becoming more and more of one class and one color. In New York City, in the school year 1957 to 58, there were 64 schools that were 90% or more American African or Puerto Rican. 6 years later, there were 134 such schools. Along with the diminution of American white middle-class contacts for a larger percentage of American Africans, observers report that the American African churches have all but lost contact with men in the northern cities as well. This may be a normal condition of urban life, but it is probably a changed condition for the American African and cannot be a socially desirable development. The only religious movement that appears to have enlisted a considerable number of lower-class American African males in northern cities of late is that of the American African Muslim, a movement based on total rejection of Anglo society, even though it emulates Anglos more. In a few words, the tangle of pathology is tightening. Final chapter. The case for national action. The object of this study has been to define a problem, rather than propose solutions to it. We have kept within these confines for these reasons. First, there are many persons, within and without the government, who do not feel the problem exists, at least in any serious degree. These persons feel that, with the legal obstacles to assimilation out of the way, matters will take care of themselves in the normal course of events. This is a fundamental issue and requires a decision within the government. Second, it is our view that the problem is so interrelated, one thing with another, that any list of program proposal would necessarily be incomplete, and would distract attention from the main point of interrelationship. We have shown a clear relation between male employment, for example, and the number of welfare-dependent children. Employment, in turn, reflects educational achievement, which depends in large part on family stability, which reflects employment. Where we should break into this cycle, and how, are the most difficult domestic questions facing the United States. We must first reach agreement on what the problem is, then we will know what questions must be answered. Third, it is necessary to acknowledge the view, held by a number of responsible persons, that the problem may be, in fact, out of control. This is a view with which we emphatically and totally disagree, but the view must be acknowledged. The continuing rises in American African educational achievement is probably the main trend that belies this thesis. On the other hand, our study has produced some clear indications that the situation may indeed have begun to feed on itself. It may be noted, for example, that through most of the post-war period, male American African unemployment and the number of the AFDC cases rose and fell together as if connected by the chain from 1945 to 1962. The correlation between the two series of data was an astonishing 0.91. This would mean that 83% of the rise and fall of AFDC cases can be statistically ascribed to the rise and fall of the unemployment rate. In 1963, this happened a second time. In 1964, a third. The possible implications of these and other data are serious enough that they, too, should be understood before program proposals are made. However, the argument of this paper does not lead to one central conclusion. Whatever the specific elements of a national effort designed to resolve this problem, those elements must be coordinated in terms of one general strategy. What then is that problem? We feel the answer is clear enough. For centuries of injustice have brought about deep-seated structural distortion in the life of the American African. At this point, the present tangle of pathology is capable of perpetuating itself without assistance. In 1964, a third of the possible implications of these and other data are serious enough that they, too, should be understood before program proposals are made. However, the argument of this paper does not lead to one central conclusion. Whatever the specific elements of a national effort designed to resolve this problem, those elements must be coordinated in terms of one general strategy. What then is that problem? We feel the answer is clear enough. For centuries of injustice have brought about deep-seated structural distortion in the life of the American African. At this point, the present tangle of pathology is capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the American Anglo world. The cycle can be broken only if these distortions are set right. In a few words, a national effort towards the problem of the American African must be directed towards the question of family structure. The object should be to strengthen the American African families so as to enable it to rise and support its members as do other families. After that, how this group of Americans chooses to run its affairs, takes advantage of its opportunities, or fails to do so, is none of the nation's business. The fundamental importance and urgency of restoring the American African family structure has been evident for some time. E. Franklin Frazier put it most concisely in 1950. As the result of family disorganization, a large proportion of American African children and youth have not undergone the socialization which only the family can provide. The disorganized families have failed to provide for their emotional needs and have not provided the discipline and habits which are necessary for personality development. Because the disorganized family has failed in its function as a socializing agency, it has handicapped its children in their relations to the institutions in the community. Moreover, family disorganization has been partially responsible for a large amount of juvenile delinquency and adult crime amongst American Africans. Since the widespread family disorganization among American Africans has resulted from the failure of the father to play his role in the family life required by American society, the migration of this problem must await those changes in the American African and American society which will enable the American African father to play the role required of him. Nothing was done in response to Frazier's argument. Matters were left to take care of themselves, and as matters will, grew worse, not better. The problem is now more serious, the obstacles greater. There is, however, a profound change for the better in one respect. The President has committed a nation to an all-out effort to eliminate poverty wherever it exists, among Anglos and American Africans, and the militant, organized, and responsible American African movement exists to join in that effort. Such a national effort could be stated thus. The policy of the United States is to bring the American African to full and equal sharing in the responsibility and rewards of citizenship. To this end, the programs of the federal government, bearing on this objective, shall be designed to have the effect, directly or indirectly, of enhancing the stability and resources of the American African family. The new beginning of the endurance. Endurance. The President, 1965 Johnson, has committed a nation to an all-out effort to eliminate poverty wherever it exists, among Anglos and American Africans, and the militant, organized, and responsible American African movement exists to join in that effort. Such a national effort could be stated thus. The policy of the United States is to bring the American African to full and equal sharing in the responsibility and rewards of citizenship. To this end, the programs of the federal government, bearing on this objective, shall be designed to have the effect, directly or indirectly, of enhancing the stability and resources of the American African family. The new beginning of the endurance.